Welcome to Cedar Fort Publishing and Media Behind the Scenes. I'm Valerie Lovelace, and I'll be your host today. And today with me on this Veterans Day special episode, I have Bob Freeman, also known as Robert C. Freeman. He is the author of the Saints at War series. Welcome, Bob.
Well, it's very nice to be with you, Valerie.
And you're also a professor at BYU in the Church History and Religion Department.
I am.
How do you love that?
Very much. I never go to work in the morning. It's just a pleasure to have the experience of the students and the faculty and all the environment that BYU provides.
So do you teach a lot of classes per day?
Well, it varies. I have been in administrative roles in the recent several years, and so that's met a decrease in my teaching load. But I'm really resuming that and happy about that prospect of being more often found in the classroom.
Is that your passion is teaching?
That's the passion.
And writing, because you've written a bunch of books. How many of these are there?
Well, in the Saints at War series, I think we're somewhere in the 7 or 8 volume category. And in addition, we've done several documentary works from this research. It's been very full-time in a way.
So these books are basically like compilations of soldiers' stories. Do you know how many stories you have throughout all have you counted?
We don't really pause to count. I've had a couple of accounts come to me in just the last week, and that's not unusual.
So it's ongoing
We have it as an ongoing archive that we build, and our greatest dividend of the research, really for me personally, has been the Saints at War collection that's been established in the L. Tom Perry Special Collections at BYU. And so that continues to grow, and that allows for the public and for family and others to come and just to learn of these wonderful accounts.
Are those accounts separate from what's in your book?
They're a part of what is in the book.
Okay, so the books what's in the books can be found there as well.
Right. Sadly, we can't begin to have as many accounts as we received represented in the volumes. So they're a representative sample, we might say, of the voices that one could find if they came to the special collections.
So explain to everybody how you get these stories, how you put them together, how it all works.
All right, that's a great question, and we receive them in a variety of ways. It may be that I learn of someone in just my work and my community and my church surroundings that becomes a referral. I might read of someone in a newspaper and want to learn more about their story. Because the project has produced as much in terms of the publications and in the documentary works, we hear from people independent of any of our efforts, and they'll come forward out of the woodwork and just let us know there's someone you need to learn about. And we're very happy to come into that awareness. And then we might reach out to them through mail or other ways and invite that sharing. We never want to impose or have anyone feel pressure about that, but only if they would like to have their voice preserved and to perhaps have it shared with others.
So how can people who don't have access to that library, how can they access these stories?
Right. Well, of course, one way is through the bookworks. Most recently, in the last year, we've published a volume on those who served in the Great War or World War I. And so that's out there and available. We also have some limited accounts on our website, which is saintsatwar.com. Again, saintsatwar, no spaces, .com. And they can also learn how to reach out and contact us if they should have a referral for us, which we would welcome. And then just in any other ways, certainly again in the video works that we've prepared as well.
And why do you do this? What got you started on this path?
Well, it's a great question, beginnings, because it really is a very simple genesis to the project. I tell about an old veteran that was in a course that I taught nearly 20 years ago, who, after a simple overview of the experience of the church during World War II, raised his hand and asked if he could just share a perspective. Well, little did I know that the individual I was calling on was himself a veteran of that wartime service. And he stood in place and shared a most poignant, perspective of the war and his experience in it. And I'll never forget, he closed by simply saying, "Brother Freeman, everything I have in my spiritual life today, I owe to that time." And I realized in the way that he shared that this was pivotal, absolutely pivotal for him in how he came into his sort of spiritual being. And then he shared about a bishop who wrote him consistently during his time in the service, about parents who prayed for and again communicated as best they could in that difficult time and environment. And then that just gave, blossom to his spiritual energies, his daily petitioning of his Father in heaven for protection. And as I took that story, I just had this yearning to learn about others that might have had similar experiences. And then I began this path of just accessing what we had in our library at BYU and other places, such as the church historical archives. And I knew very soon that we needed to reach further and to talk to those who were with us still, particularly of that generation, what some have dubbed the greatest generation. And so that's what began our movement, if you will. And it was expected it would be short-termed, that we would just do this for a couple of years, close out our experience, and move on to other research endeavors. But then we began to hear from others, from other conflicts. And it was sort of in the spirit of, don't forget us. We were also in harm's way, and we served in difficult environments. And so, well, that began our journey toward the Korean War, and then Vietnam, and then modern-day conflicts. And it just has never gone away. And for that, I'm very grateful, because through those lives and very important accounts, it has really been a satisfying opportunity for me.
Do you feel like wars shape our culture more than any other influences?
Well, it wouldn't be very hard for me to say, answer affirmatively that they do shape our culture. They shape our times. We can talk about individual battles that have shaped history, world history. And so its impact, I think most will realize immediately is great. I think when you drop this, historical happenings into context, and then you add as an overlay the church experience in wartime, that's a very important perspective, and it's one that I care a lot about, because my employment is with the religious education area of the campus of BYU. And so I'm not just a historian. In fact, I'm not a military historian by training, but I care very much about the impact of wars on the church. And that's found in a number of ways. The impact on the missionary program would be an obvious example, where the drawdown of potential missionaries is going to be impacted by war. And so what does that look like? Many would be aware that initial beginnings of the church, in particular lands altogether, came about in the context of war. Korea would be a very good example of that. Really, the seeds for the gospel going forward in Korea were planted in the very difficult environment of war.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. I didn't realize that. So which wars do you cover? You've got, we talked about World War I and II. Do you go as far back as the Mormon Battalion?
Valerie, it is every and any conflict that we care about. And more than just those who are serving in uniform and at the battle's front, those who are at the arrears and who are supporting the effort, not only in wartime, but in peacetime as well. We're interested in the home front. And really, we want to know more about the experiences of those who are supporting the soldier away to war. And I would be terribly remiss if I didn't acknowledge that it's not just been my research opportunity, but I've had a number of colleagues that I've shared that experience with. And so as a team, we've reached out. There has been some specialization of just different conflicts and different colleagues, and that's been helpful because each one has its complexities and depth that needs to be understood more fully.
Let's talk about some of your favorite stories that you've compiled. Let's start with what's your all-time, and not necessarily favorite, but which one has really stuck with you the most?
Okay, that's a hard question.
Yeah, it's got to be hard because you must have hundreds.
Yeah, it's hundreds.
Maybe even thousands?
We certainly have thousands of accounts.
Yeah.
And I should indicate that not every account that we receive has what we might describe as overt, spiritual experiences of great note, at least that the veteran has chosen to share, and we don't pry and probe further than is right. So a number of accounts that we receive are pretty straightforward, and they document maybe boot camp and deployments or different geographies they might have served in. There might be some things about family and longing for home, those types of things. Some of the accounts actually have some humor in them, and some have, a lot about the travels and the different peoples and cultures that they interact with. But the stories I think you're asking about do tend to have a very important silver or spiritual thread that is integrated in them. And that, by the way, that phrase, silver threads, is a phrase that was employed by then Elder Gordon B. Hinckley back in the 1960s after he both visited Vietnam during that terrible war and dedicated South Vietnam for the preaching of the gospel at that time. And he talked about the dark tapestry of war and the difficult nature of war, but then also talked about how there are silver threads and that sometimes great good can come even in the harshest of environments, that the gospel could have its beginnings. I can't help but think of that right now with the planned travel of President Nelson to Vietnam in the coming weeks, and how that this is a truly historic moment. And those early experiences in Vietnam, Elder Hinckley and Elder Hanks, Marion D. Hanks, and others saw and were a part of the servicemen who ministered there, of the native Vietnamese who joined the church, very often in great hardship to them. But they were pioneers. And now, today, in 2019, we're seeing a harvest that's a great blessing, and President Nelson being a part of that. So in that way, it's exciting. Now, to the stories. Well, I don't have a favorite. I really think I have to confess that. But I have, at any given time, experiences that circulate in my mind that typically are, they're prompted by particular events or circumstances. The example I just gave of Vietnam, and now with President Nelson's upcoming visit there, would be a good one. And I think of people like Lucky Larry Chesley, who served as an airman in Vietnam, who was taken as a POW. He later, after the war, authored a volume, 7 Years in Hanoi, where he describes what it was for him to be 7 years a prisoner of war and the hardships that he endured. He was injured when he was taken, seriously injured when he was taken as a POW, and yet he got through that. His faith remained intact. He had desperate times and desperate experiences, but he remained strong in the faith. And he went on to have a very successful career after the war. I mentioned last year we published a volume on World War I. And I would just say, in connection with that conflict, one of the stories I like to tell is of a man by the name of Thomas Nybar. And Thomas Nybar was a farm boy from Idaho who entered the service during the Great War and was deployed to France. And in his time in combat, he had a most unusual experience where he and others were put in great danger in a operation that they were a part of. Several died in the process of this battle that were very near to him, and he weathered that somehow. He was able to survive, and at one juncture in time, he's presented with an opportunity to take a good number of German prisoners or German soldiers out, and he's prepared to do that. In the process, he's injured, but somehow it's a very dramatic story. I won't provide the longer version here. He's able to take captive about a dozen German soldiers, and I can just picture in my mind's eye as he's taking them back to his American colleagues, and he's wounded and nursing this leg wound. He still has his revolver, and he's, keeping an eye on everyone. And his fellow soldiers can't believe, as he returns to camp, what he's accomplished. It's just amazing to them. And instantly they, put into action a way to take care of these prisoners. And then, when the time was right, they passed along this account to the powers that would be, and in consequence, he was awarded the Medal of Honor, which, as you know, is this nation's highest commendation for service. Well, he returned home after the war because of his wound and other circumstances. He was unable to successfully obtain full-time employment in his agricultural farming community of Sugar City, Idaho, and this was very discouraging for him. He also over time became a single head of his home, and so he had children, and there were stresses and strains that came with that. And the short of it is he got very discouraged, and near the end of his life, he actually took his Medal of Honor and mailed it back to Washington, D.C., and expressed his discouragement and expressed his a sense of having no way forward, and that medal wasn't doing him any good. And of course, this is at a time when there was no institutional support of consequence for veterans, and even communities didn't quite know how to do that. And so he passed away shortly after that at a relatively young age and somewhat obscure, and time sort of forgot Thomas Nybar. And then a number of years ago, maybe a dozen or so, the community of Sugar House really rose to the occasion to remember their fallen hero.
Sugar City.
Sugar City, I apologize.
Sugar House is here in Utah.
Sugar City, Idaho. And they really, in some sense, a little bit of repentance to go back and reclaim that story in history. And there was a great celebration held. I attended, and it was amazing. The freeway exit from the freeway into the center of town was just completely covered with flags along the way. Wow. And they renamed the park for him and had a beautiful monument in his memory. And I pay great tribute to Sugar House to go back and look at history more closely and say we really had a hero here.
Mm-hmm. He must have felt like, he received this very high award and then came home and it was like it meant nothing back at home, right? Right.
So interesting, he actually received several distinguished service awards. And I neglected to say, when he came home, sort of that train into town arrival, he was recognized for his heroism. And then that's when it all stopped.
Yeah, he must have felt like on his way home and seeing that, the the war, I'm done with the war and I can move on with my life, but he really wasn't able to.
Right.
Was it because of his injuries that he wasn't able to work?
That seems to be the case, that in a predominantly agricultural community, he just couldn't land that full-time
I have to wonder if
occupation.
he might have had like PTSD or something
And I
too
think-
that wasn't recognized at that time.
Very likely went
Yeah.
with the experience as well.
Wow. Wow, that's really sad.
Yeah.
But it's great that, he's finally getting the recognition.
Well, some of his descendants were at the city commemoration when it was held, and it was very heartening for them to realize and probably learn themselves a little more about Thomas and his service, but to realize the community really had returned to history and wanted to make it right.
Do you get a lot of accounts that people send in that they're finding in like journals and that sort of thing?
Sure. And one other kind of, so you had asked earlier, and I apologize, I maybe didn't respond adequately to the question, how do we get these accounts? Very often, the veteran has passed on. We don't have access to the one who served. So families will find these accounts and they will share them. And that's important. And I'm working with a World War I a veteran descendant right now who's the last of the line, she reports. And she wants to be sure that the account of her great uncle, it actually is preserved. And it turns out he was the first casualty from Utah in the Great War, and the newspapers and such seem to support that assertion. And so we're finding this powerful account, and it's just a family member who said, "Don't forget this Brother Grow is his name that served and was taken so early in life." For those that are veterans with us still, but maybe haven't, really provided an account yet of their experiences, but want to. This sets up as a very meaningful family time to share, and a family will get together and they'll actually record an account, and then we will transcribe it for the family and give back a copy to the family that they can have for their purposes, and then we keep one at our library. So that's one way I might recommend anyone in that situation could reach out to us, and we can partner in that.
Mm-hmm. It would be interesting if, while you're doing your family history, to, come across an ancestor in here and have another little piece of the puzzle to your family history.
Absolutely. We get a lot of artifacts that are to the time of the service of veterans, and one of those that I've really appreciated is just been minutes of LDS group meetings and such, where you see this long list of names of who attended, and then the nature of the meeting. And I mean, they get everything right down to who prayed the prayers, sang the hymns, what the hymns were, and gave the talks. And you see these names, and I found myself more than once saying, well, I know someone who carries that same first and last name, or at least the surname, and reached out. And more than once we've made connections to families. So that can be exciting.
In preparation and speaking with you today, I went on your website and I was reading the very first story that was on there. And I think it was a World War II story, but it was talking about these soldiers who they didn't know who was LDS. And so the chaplain, the Army chaplain, helped them discover each other. And then they had a sacrament meeting in a house that was like half torn down.
Yes.
And then when I got in here and I looked at your book, The Saints at War, the smaller one, that's like what's on the cover. They're having a sacrament meeting with their mess kit right there, aren't they?
Right.
I thought, wow, that's really cool.
It may or may not be a Sunday. It's often said there are no Sundays in war.
Right.
Because they don't really take time off that way. But when they could have an opportunity to join with one or more other Latter-day Saints, and distinct to our faith tradition, they could actually have the sacrament, right? And so they could partake of the emblems of the sacrament. They knew how to conduct a meeting, and the contents of what a meeting might look like. And it'll be very simple in most cases. I had the privilege, and it really was that, of interviewing Elder Neil A. Maxwell before his passing. And he talked about that kind of a gathering, and talked about that happening quite regularly in his opportunity. He was in a place called Okinawa in the Pacific War. So we're talking World War II period. And he talked about what that meant to them, and also that this was a kind of role-taking for those who maybe were missing from a meeting to look into and make sure of their whereabouts. So that would have been quite a context to do that in. And I'm told that the very partaking of the sacrament was really quite a solemn thing. They would think very seriously about those covenants, and that everything depended on the reliance on God to them at that time. Pretty powerful stuff.
Yeah. Are there a lot of accounts about the kind of emotional internal struggles that some of them were having with, being at war, having to kill other fellow human beings and believing what they believe?
Well, yes. I'm inclined to introduce the name John Flade. And he was a German Latter-day Saint who served as a forward observer for the armies of the Third Reich. And, of course, this is a complex, dynamic, right? And we wonder at these things. But here he was faced with the obligation of representing his country, and he goes forward into battle. When we interviewed him, he made the comment, bless his heart, he even had a smile at one point that he said, I was tortured by the fact that, I could be looking across the way at an American soldier who could be a member of the church, my brother, he said in his beautiful German accent. And he said, that was really hard for me. And then he smiled. He says, well, maybe that's why I wasn't such a good shot. He didn't want to have the chance of taking the life of a fellow saint. But I think for many this would have been a great challenge. Now, I have to conclude that sharing of John Flade by indicating that he was at length, he was taken prisoner of war by the Americans. So here you have this German Latter-day Saint soldier. He's taken prisoner of war by the Americans, and he's going to be relocated to the States, stateside. And so he comes into New York Harbor on a ship and lays eyes in the morning of their arrival on the Statue of Liberty. And in his interview with us, he describes the tears that came freely because for him, a German POW, looking at the Statue of Liberty, he knew that represented a kind of freedom that he had never known in his young life. Well, interestingly, he goes on to conclude the war as a prisoner of war and returns to his homeland, and then relocates to America after the war, where he raises a family, and eventually is returning to Germany as a mission president in his later years. So sort of an interesting rest of the story in his case. So stories are what I do. That's really the core of our research with the Saints at War series. And, well, I have so many. Having just told the story of John Flade and his being in the European conflict and a German Latter-day Saint, I'd like to move to the other hemisphere, and we'll go to the Pacific conflict, the Pacific theater, and the story of a man by the name of Phil Shumway. So Phil Shumway called his home Orem, Utah, and came to the Pacific Theater as an airman. And he was young and newly married when he went off to war. And it wasn't very long into his service that he accepted the assignment of relocating a plane. And I picture in my mind's eye just from one island to another. And he's flying solo, and he's a single plane in this errand. And it's a new plane, and he's just bringing it into service. But somehow the plane malfunctions along the way. It's not because of enemy fire or anything that way, but it is defective in some way. And he eventually has to dash it in the ocean, and that would have been dramatic, of course, all by itself. Fortunately, there is a tube, a roper raft that's on board, and it inflates and carries him to the surface. He survives the crash, and now we picture him just on the surface of the Pacific Ocean, and he begins what will be a long ordeal waiting for a rescue. And the first day, at some point, he is aware of a search plane that comes in close proximity, but he's unable to get its attention, and it goes on, and that's the end of any search efforts. The war is too big, and there is just too much going on to really pause very long. He just didn't show up, and so they did what they could. And the first day goes into the second into the third, and now we see young Phil Shumway on day 7 of his time on this little tube. Very little provisions. He's weak, and the sun and all of the effects, we can only imagine how difficult that would have been.
Wow, 7 days is a long time to go with very little food and water, out in the elements, in the sun, with no shelter. We will return tomorrow with the second part of this series for Veterans Day with Bob Freeman, and we will continue the story of Phil Shumway.